Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Marshawn motherfucking Brooks show. Got a new mic here, so learning how to use that, set the gain, and all that kind of bullshit is going to be a work in progress. Something I'll be working on in the next few episodes, trying to bring you, the listener, who, I was going to say listener doesn't exist yet, but I think we have one. I think we have one in France, if I'm not mistaken. If Buzzsprout, which is the directory that I personally use, is not misleading me, I think we got a fella out in France who's been listening to these episodes. So shout out, my friend. Tell your friends. We'll get a real crew together. Anywho, obviously I've been slacking off on uploading these. Like I said last episode, I absolutely have to be better about that. No excuses. Like Seth Godin says, showing up to engage with the practice consistently is the way that we grow things. It's the way that we make change. I talked a little bit before about how I got COVID recently, and my life was kind of reaching a point where I was falling apart a little bit, and I chalked it up to all sorts of things, the symptoms I was feeling. I thought, hey, it's just a storm's coming on. Sometimes I get headaches due to the change in barometric pressure, sinus pain, all this other stuff. Always another explanation, classic denial. So I go finally to get tested, and I do it at a drive-through site. Only place that I could really feasibly get in that day, that same day. Everywhere else was booked solid. I know places that were doing, rapid tests, same day results, but obviously they were, the hottest commodities. People had been going to those first, and as a result, they had no slots open. So, drive through it was. So I ended up being stuck in that line for about 3 hours, maybe 4 hours. And I've always hated lines. I know everybody does, or most people, I should say, do. I have a particular disdain for not only the experience of waiting in line, but also what waiting in line represents. I despise admin. I despise bureaucracy. I despise maybe not the middlemen themselves, but certainly the existence of a system that incentivizes them. The existence of a system that incentivizes the bean counter over the creative, the paper pusher over the man in the arena. It's somewhat of a philosophical thing with me, somewhat of an existential dislike of what, say the DMV or institutions like it represent. Though I do acknowledge we need them to a certain extent to make a large scale society run with any degree of fluidity, that doesn't mean I'm going to enjoy the experience of drumming my fingers on my thigh as I wait for 40 minutes to advance one spot closer to the counter. So a thought occurred to me while I was waiting that I had never really considered before where lines came from. Who invented them? You have to think at some point people had to assemble in that specific format with the attendant understanding that comes along with it, that first come, first serve, I'm ahead of you, I'm closer to this thing than you are, we're all going to wait here like civil human beings in a free society and wait until we all get our names called or our ticket is the next one. But lines have been part of, I'd say, all of our lives for so long, since before they began, that I had never stopped to wonder Where did they come from? How did they first start to exist? Who was the first person? Where was the first location where they kind of cropped up? So, as it turns out, lines haven't always existed, or at least it doesn't seem as though they have. I was reading this article. I want to say it was on. I want to say it was on Slate.com. I could be wrong about that. About the origin or presumed origin of lines. Uh, I had assumed that the Q was a natural and eternal consequence of our morphology. Just our bodies line, no pun intended, line up well that way. It just makes sense, so we've always done it. But as it turns out, the first historical record of the line appeared in 1837, a book called The French Revolution by Thomas Carlyle. And he was depicting a scene where the French had lined up during wartime or after wartime to receive bread. It was a time of scarcity, so obviously first come, first serve. Very important to have people receiving sustenance in an organized manner. And before that, there exists no record that I could find of lines, of a queue, of whatever they call it in your country. Shout out to my French friend. Thanks for inventing the line. I'm going to blame you on that one. And that got me thinking. It's so easy to assume that what we see, what we grew up around, what we experience in our day-to-day life is just how it is. That what we know is all there is to know. That what we hear is all there is to hear. What we see is all there is to see. If I had assumed that about something as fundamental as a line, something that simple, what other assumptions had I made? What other erroneous leaps in logic had I made and just assumed, hey, this is an inevitable part of life? What other things that would turn out to be cultural artifacts had I just assumed to be a part of human existence? You know, a few years back, let me take a sip of my coffee here. A few years back, maybe, man, between 3 and 5 years ago, I read A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Now, for those of you unfamiliar, or perhaps just who read it a long time ago, Brave New World is a dystopian novel. And in my opinion, it has pretty eerie parallels to our present day world. That in 1984, I think make a very interesting pairing. You know, because certain elements of each you see crop up. But on as terrifying as 1984 is, with an authoritarian government wielding unlimited amounts of power over the people under it, Aldous Huxley's work is almost more unsettling to me because the people in some ways choose it, in many ways prefer it. It's not necessarily a regime of military power, but it maintains its stability via, you know, some authoritarian means. Like genetic engineering is involved, brainwashing, all that kind of stuff. But I'd say the core of the power that government wields stems from the acceptance and adulation of its people. Even when people are shown an alternative, especially when they're shown an alternative, they choose to stay enslaved. They choose what they know, what they've been shown their entire lives. They choose what's familiar because that's how it always been. That's how it's always been, and they just assume that's how it always will be. And in making that assumption, they accept that. And accepting it, they start to love it. So this society that Aldous Huxley paints a picture of in his probably his most famous novel. I know Doors of Perception was another popular work of his, but I had no doubt Brave New World is his most famous work. Their entire society is typified by the pursuit of impulsive pleasure and the worship of comfort above all else. You know, their entire civilization is sex and drugs. Not that I'm against either of those things, they're both real fun. They are bereft of any transcendent meaning outside of service to the state, service to their government, service to, there's a literal panel of people called the world controllers, service to them. They are discouraged from thinking of any higher ideal. Even they have a caste system, the alphas being at the top. Even the alphas are not truly free. They don't have true freedom of cognitive traps and prisons. Perhaps they've bought into the system more than anyone else because it's been so good to them. All these citizens, everyone that lives in that society, is conditioned from birth to think in alignment with a value system the state has prescribed to them and to love their place in the hierarchy so they feel no need to step outside the roles they were given. If you can teach a man to hold a value system that tells him, well, what is it to be a man? And to be a man is to be a provider, to be a good worker, to be conscientious, to be on time, to always pay your mortgage the day the bill comes. Well, that's a man that's going to be a good consumer. That's a man that's going to make a stable and predictable cog in a larger machine. That's a man that can be relied upon to always run out on Black Fridays, Christmases, Valentine's Days, open his wallet, always swallow whatever pill the man, so to speak, wants to hold out for him. In incentivizing through cultural means this sort of identity, getting people to internalize these notions of service to your country, which I love my country. Absolutely. But it's men throughout history have been taught to sacrifice themselves for others, whether it be for a wife, whether it be for a family, a religion, a god, a church, a nation, a town, a city, to act not in service of himself, but in service of something he is presumably a part of. I would argue that for much of human history, the favor has not been returned. That while men have sacrificed themselves in both literal and figurative ways, those institutions, those people, those what have you, have not returned the favor and made that behavior incentivized, made that sacrifice something worth making. But the programming remains. I mean, you look at what are some famous examples. I know, at least stateside here, it's coming to my attention that this might go to an international audience, so maybe I have to couch my references that I would just assume that Americans would know. Maybe I have to couch those and kind of explain some of them. I'm not sure any feedback there would be helpful. There's a company, at least here, called Kay's Jewelers, and they are this mega corporation that peddles diamonds. I would say first and foremost, but more so than diamonds, which are, I mean, we all know that this jig is up, the story's out. We all know that they're pretty much worthless inherently, but they maintain their stranglehold on an undeniably useless industry by selling an image, by peddling a narrative. The advertisements they run, their tagline is "Every kiss begins with K." They peddle the idea that if you sacrifice 3 to 6 months of your wages, you'll get love in return. You'll get admiration, affection, and respect in return. You'll be seen as a man, as a provider. You'll be looked up to and in certain ways looked after by making that sacrifice. This is just one example of roles that people internalize that might serve somebody else. They certainly serve the shareholders of Cage's Jewelers if they're publicly traded, but they don't really serve the people who hold them. And I've started to think, to myself at least, what beliefs do I hold? What roles and ideas have I internalized as fact that are meant to make me a servant to somebody else or to something else? How much of my value system has actually been created by me and for me to serve me in my own betterment, in my own advancement, in my own egress from the matrix? And how much of it is just meant to make me another reliable cog in the machine? Anyway, all that aside, so the citizens in this novel are all fed from birth a steady diet of a drug called soma. Soma is a drug. They carry like bandoliers full of this stuff. Soma is a drug that wipes away all negative emotion, all sadness, anxiety, fear from the user. It has a sedative effect on the population. And citizens in that world live most of their lives under the effect of that drug. They're all doped up. They're still able to function in their daily life, but they're constantly popping pills. And in that way, that almost nobody thinks to ask questions. It's a reflexive response if somebody starts to exhibit, signs of negative emotion, a frown, wringing of the hands, worried look crosses their face. Hey, take your soma. And there are tons of ways in which we do that. I've never loved when people ask me, "Hey, how you doing? How's it going today?" And we just say, "Oh, great. Oh, good. I'm fine." But a lot of times, I'm not fine. A lot of times I'm not good. If good, I mean, let's just let's say neutral. Me feeling neutral is average. Well, then by definition, wouldn't I be feeling below average half the time? So at least half the time, yeah, I'm not feeling good. People don't ask that question to hear how you're actually feeling. They ask it as a social pleasantry. It makes people uncomfortable to deal with the darker sides of human emotion, the more difficult, complex and nuanced parts of our psyche and ourselves. I'm not even talking Jungian shadow here stuff. I'm talking, I mean, just basically feeling a little under the weather, maybe a little blah because I have to go to work. I didn't really feel like it that day. That's a perfectly valid thing that all of us feel. Sure, don't let your emotions stop you from doing what you have to do. We all feel it, and we're not supposed to say it. Just smile, keep your head down, and keep being a cog for your corporation, for your company. So, most of the citizens in this world live under the influence of this drug. And there may not be necessarily a perfect analog for it in our world. I don't think we have one drug that everybody takes all the time and is just socially reinforced, at least in Western culture. But we have many. We have alcohol. Some people who abuse marijuana. We have pornography. We have TV. We have all sorts of mind-numbing, mindless distractions. Social media. I mean, I wouldn't even say it's mind-numbing. I think it actively makes and is designed to make people feel terrible about themselves and other people. I don't think there can be much controversy about that. We have all these psychoactive agents that serve to distract the populace, that serve to sway our minds away from a higher purpose. And look, do I think there's a world controller? Do I think that there's a group of 12 men sitting in a room with their fingers steepled and concocting plans like Mr. Burns in The Simpsons? No, not really. However, when you set up what Eric Weinstein might call a perverse incentive structure, you incentivize people to act against the best interest of others and try to get a short-term gain at the expense of the long-term, what would be good in the long to medium term for a country, for a corporation, and certainly for the individuals that comprise either of those institutions. Even if there's not, an Illuminati, so to speak, there are certainly incentive structures that act as if the goal is to sway you from a higher purpose. It doesn't matter necessarily if the stated objective of the people sitting down to make the next iteration of Instagram is to distract you. I don't think anyone's trying to stop you or me as individuals. I do think that people profit the more time you spend in the infinity pool of Instagram, the more time you spend in the comment section of YouTube, the more ads that come across your screen, the more revenue is generated for the companies selling them. And that's enough. That's enough to keep you from a higher goal. That's enough to keep you where you are. A little lamb, stagnant, benign, predictable, consuming everything that the man puts in front of you. So while there may not be a man with a capital M, there are men, and their goals oftentimes are not in alignment with yours. So it's worth spending some time getting clear about what it is you want, how it is you can get there, and whether or not any of these sedatives or distractions are going to assist you in that venture. So there's a couple of dialogues with this character in this book named Mustafa Mond. And he's one of those world controllers. You know, as close to an Illuminati figure that I just satirized. It's as close to one of those as you're going to get in a narrative like this. And he's talking about the philosophical underpinnings of the society, how everything's good and there's no reason to be upset in a society where you are suffocated by comfort. And he says there's always soma to calm your anger, to reconcile you to your enemies, to make you patient and long suffering. In the past, you could only accomplish these things by making a great effort, and after years of hard moral training. Anybody can be virtuous now. You can carry at least half your morality about in a bottle. Christianity without the tears. That's what soma is. And man, if that doesn't hit home, if that isn't what it's all about, you see, in past generations, and I'm not one to try to glorify the past. I think that there's never been a better time to be alive than right now, especially if you are in one of many people groups that might not have had a great time were you born in 1930. However, I think it's pretty hard to deny that, at least in years past, people had family traits. People had a craft that they plied. That was how you made a living. And that wasn't a great thing because a lot of times that came at the expense of personal choice. A lot of times people had to go into a family business that they didn't choose, they were just kind of born into. Now we get, in some ways, infinite choice, depending on where we were born, what situation we were born into. And that's left people lost. That's left people confused. That's made it so that we are incentivized to be fungible, to be replaceable. I don't use the phrase cog in a machine thoughtlessly, because it's very stable, at least for a company, if they can replace you. It's a lot easier for people to understand the value you bring to them if there's something like you. If you're something they've seen before, it's easier to wrap their mind around what it is that you're offering. And people, given the choice, would rather get something now than get something later. I am certainly no exception. I am incredibly impatient by nature. I, I get stressed out if I feel like I'm not seeing progress in a particular endeavor. You don't want to have sunk years into something only to have it be for nothing. That's a nightmare. I imagine you were like an Aikido black belt in the 1990s, and all of a sudden jiu-jitsu comes along, MMA comes along, and you spent 10 plus years training this stuff and really trying hard, only to find out you invested your skill points in the wrong tree, and now it doesn't really count for much. So impatience is understandable. It's not necessarily something to be ashamed of. However, because, at least in part, because we are not incentivized in a way that we used to be to have a craft, but I mean that with a capital C, we often don't. We often have a job where we fill out Excel spreadsheets and shuffle paperwork around all day. And when we leave that company or that company leaves us, they just get somebody else to do the same job. You see, we weren't craftsmen. We were just a gear. We were just a component of a larger organism that could be swapped out and replaced at the drop of a hat. Being a craftsman takes time and practice and mind-numbing repetition. And it'd be so much easier to get Christianity without the tears, to avoid years of hard moral training. But avoiding that is also going to avoid the development that takes place along the way. It's also going to avoid the personal growth. I see this a lot with Tinder, I think. One of the reasons that I'm not crazy about it as a concept. Let's say, hypothetically, that you were in a position where you could get great results through an app like that. Most men aren't going to, for reasons that it's a whole other episode. Let's say, for hypothesis sake, that you could. Well, is that really going to result in some sort of physiological, psychological, and existential transformation? Is learning how to make a decent profile and get some results and matches with it going to have the same effect as learning how to go up, talk to strangers, push past fears, lead other people through their anxieties and into desire? Is that going to have the same kind of carryover into other aspects of life? I don't think so. I don't think that getting matches and learning how to type out a little bio, even if in terms of numbers, it was similar, the same, or even higher, even slightly superior, I see no way in which that could be even remotely close in developing the hard moral training, so to speak. So back to the book. This main character, Bernard. There's a couple protagonists that we go back and forth between. Bernard was raised in this dystopia. He's received all the same conditioning that his peers have. And he's lived his entire life feeling defective because he lacks this rabid submission to the state that seems to come so naturally to everybody else. This has always made him feel a bit off, feel inferior to other people, because he's had trouble accepting the narratives that he's been told his whole life. And nobody else seems to have this difficulty. Everything seems just fine to everybody else. He's the only one that's asking the questions. He's the only one that seems to feel doubt, that seems to wonder, is there something more? And sometimes he doesn't want to take his soma. Sometimes he doesn't want to engage in these incredible group orgies that they have in his society. Sometimes he wants to take a walk out under the stars. Sometimes he wants to be alone. Sometimes he wants something more than just impulsive pleasure. And for that, he's made to feel defective. There's another character. I would argue that he's the other protagonist of the book. I think his name is John. but they call him the Savage in this book. The people of the dystopia do anyway. And he was raised outside of the state. He was raised kind of like the Outlands, if you can imagine, this lawless place. It's kind of almost like the Wild West, and they still have trappings of today's society. They have, traditional monogamy. My own thoughts on that are, again, a whole other episode. They have marriage. They have literature, things that they don't have in the state. And at the end of the book, he exchanges words with this world controller, and he's just defying him to the bitter end. They're having somewhat of an existential exchange. John, the Savage, representing a set of values that are seen in this world as archaic and outdated, and this world controller doing what he can to convince him to just embrace what he sees as the future and is certainly the present. And there's this exchange they have which always stuck with me. And the world controller says to him, basically, you are fighting for the right to be miserable. He says, yeah, I absolutely am. You see, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. How many of us have looked around us and seen everybody else seeking comfort? Everybody else actively running away from any hardship. And instead, seeking coziness. How many of us have felt out of place because we didn't want to lay in a feather bed all day? We wanted to feel, we wanted to experience this. We wanted the highs and the lows, the ups and the downs. How many of us have felt like we were dying when life was just a creamy middle? It felt like we were the defective ones. Like we were the weirdos and the outcasts. Because we wanted to feel. Because we wanted to be alive. And man, that exchange has always stuck with me. Even that state of being isn't natural or good for a human being. Living in this constant state of either comfort, which I would argue comfort really is just the absence of sensation. If you really think of it. I heard it put interestingly once, how would you define comfort? Like, it's easy to define discomfort, but you can't really define comfort. Like, comfort is just a lack of discomfort, the same way that you don't know what an unsore muscle feels like. You know what a sore muscle feels like. How do you tell if your muscle is sore? Rather, how do you tell if your muscle is unsore? Well, it's not sore. And that's how I would view it. I would view it as, well, comfort really, for being realistic, is the absence of feeling. Maybe the absence of pain, but I would argue it's also the absence of life. Because that's what life is. Life is intense. And even intense pleasure is uncomfortable. Does that mean we don't want it? Does that mean you don't want to embrace it? You don't want to be alive? Even for citizens in the new world of the state, of this new society, living in this constant state of impulsive pleasure exacts its toll. They have to do these things called violent passion surrogates, where once a month people go to this conditioning center and have their systems flooded with adrenaline. Rob Sapolsky, this professor at Stanford, I heard him talking about kind of the state of our society and how the human organism was designed to have very acute bouts of stress. You're wandering on the African veldt, you see a lion, you sprint away, you're absolutely terrified out of your mind, and then the stress is gone. It's good. You return to baseline, to homeostasis. Oh no, now you see a rhinoceros, you run away. These acute, tiny little bouts of stress, and you're either 100 or you're zero. Whereas now we have all these tiny, nagging little things. Oh, I have to do that. I have to do this. I have to mail in this piece of paper. I have to sign this form. I have to. You can tell that based on my examples, I really don't like paperwork. But whatever it is, man. These tiny little things that aren't life and death in the day, but they're a pain in the ass to do, and they accumulate in your mind. They start taking mental bandwidth, and they start making you, angry, tired, upset, frustrated, subtracting from your creative endeavors, subtracting from your overall well-being and health. Because the human organism was not designed to live with chronic stress. It was designed to cope with acute stress. And we see that in this story, it takes a constant drugging, artificial adrenaline, and a steady diet of porn and passive entertainment to keep the beast at bay, to keep people away from their natural state. A state that is in many ways much better for them. As men, I think a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us, are acutely aware that we live in a world that wasn't made for us. We made things safer. We built mile-high walls around our cities with Jericho missiles pointing outwards so that no enemy could ever touch us. And we found that we didn't feel alive if we weren't in the forest. If there wasn't a chance that something could happen, that shit could hit the fan. And I am glad that I can walk down the street day to day and, sometimes people try something. A lot of times people don't. And I'm glad that most of the time I don't have to worry all that much about shit popping off. Be prepared for it, obviously. But I think we can all agree that it's preferable to have a society where things function in an orderly way most of the time. But too much order gets stale, gets brittle, and chokes the life out of you. Too much order and the lack of any obstacle starts to make a man soft, starts to make a man weak, starts to rob him of what makes him a man in the first place. And the less challenge and difficulty life provides to you, just as a matter of course, I think the more we have to provide to ourselves and take on willingly. A lot of us go through life with a nagging feeling that we're coasting through a hologram. At least I do. Like, is this it? So many times, and I don't have the vocabulary for it yet. So many times throughout the course of a day, I feel like I could just reach out and just peel the curtain back and see what's really going on. And not, I don't use the term the matrix just to use it. Sometimes it really feels like that, man. Like say I'm sitting in line. Let's say I'm at a Starbucks or something. And everybody's just on their phone because we don't want to look at each other. We don't want to talk to each other. And even the interactions that we do have are really artificial. I just want to say, hey, man, What if we just didn't do this? What if we just didn't default to the stranger interaction? What if we did something different? Or like go behind the counter and take my own cookie as opposed to waiting for the, what do they call it, barista to get it for me, then talk to her friend for 5 minutes and just go, leave my money, leave. Just do something unexpected. Nothing criminal. Just do something that is out of the norm. Because why not? Like that we get in so many of these ruts. We have so many of these unspoken little social contracts and societal expectations. And we never really sit down to question why they're there, why they exist, and if they're serving us. Are they useful? Are they helpful? In all situations, in some. And I don't quite have the vocabulary. Not yet. And I certainly haven't yet escaped. But I do have the nagging sensation that there's a veil pulled over my eyes. I'm speaking for me here. There's a real world laying just beneath my ability to see it. There's something bigger and more exciting than just working a 9 to 5 or whatever crazy hours I get assigned. Trying to make a paycheck, trying to make rent every month. I know, man, life is more exciting than that. And I know there are arts of living and ways to navigate through the world that are bigger than that, bolder than that, more dangerous, more daring than that. And I don't know yet how to access them, how to tap into that and pull that veil back. But I have the sneaking suspicion that it's possible. Look, at the end of the day, I think most of what the majority of us deal with on a day-to-day basis is artifice. It's not real. It's not real. The real world. It's not real life. Trudging through paperwork and small talk, censoring myself, and being this fake saccharine version of who I really am, because the actual person that lays beneath is too controversial, too exciting. I don't want to say too real. It's kind of played out. But y'all know what I mean. It would be too much of a disruption to business as usual if we were all who we were. And to a certain extent, I understand that. To a certain extent, I get that. And there's value in having people conduct themselves in a socially accepted way. And having people toe a party line and follow a rule set. Because if everyone just did what they wanted all the time, nothing would ever get done. But just sitting, rotting in a cubicle like veal waiting to be slaughtered, man, that's not what it's about. I know there's more to it than that. And a lot of guys who are going to hear this are probably in that scenario and justify it. I'm doing it for my family. Oh, just another year, 12 more months, and then I'm going to go do this other thing. But gentlemen, if we're not taking action on it now, are we really ever going to? If we don't have action steps lined out and we're not actively moving toward it, we're moving away from it. And now's the time. While the world has gone sideways and still is, and everybody else is staying stagnant, now is your opportunity. We're, as a whole, growing less and less connected to our true nature. Very few of us have what is another Eric Weinstein, what he would call a relationship with the unforgiving. And he never sits down and necessarily defines the unforgiving, but I think I know what he means. You look at something like stand-up comedy. where if you don't accomplish the task, there's no bullshit there. You're not getting fake laughs. You set out there and you're not hiding your intention. Right? What constitutes success in that domain is very clear. And if you don't adhere to what it means to be successful within that realm, you will be punished for it brutally. Nobody's going to give you a participation medal. Nobody's going to pat you on the back and say, that's all right. You showed up. Good job. You go out in a boxing match or a jiu-jitsu tournament or an MMA fight and you fuck up, you're going to be made to pay for it in a very dire and public way. If you go and you go ask some girl out, do a cold approach, she's not gonna fuck you just because, well, you're so brave. No, you have to do things right in order to generate a result. And the unforgiving is, yes, unforgiving, and it can be cruel. It doesn't feel good to get tapped out 16 times in a practice. I've never done stand-up, but I'm sure it doesn't feel good to go on stage and bomb. It certainly doesn't feel up to, go do a cold approach and be violently and hilariously rejected. But this relationship with the unforgiving does give us a distinct advantage. It puts us in closer contact with reality. And I've started to think of reality, that which lays beneath these layers of, cultural expectation and the social scripts that we've been talking about. All that bullshit, all the paperwork, all the drama, all the lies that we tell other people because we want to look good. I've started to think of reality not as just a solid set of facts and figures and forms. I've started to think about reality in kind of, almost high and low resolution. Like there are times in your life that feel more real than others, where you are brought into a greater clarity and focus as a result of the demands of the situation. If you go out, let's say to a grappling tournament, you got to be dialed in because you have a man across the mat from you who wants to hurt you. You have a man across the mat from you that wants to win just as bad, if not more so, than you do. If you do any of the other activities that we were talking about, anything which could be deemed unforgiving, you are inhabiting a space of heightened reality. And the decisions that you make in those moments matter a lot more than the decisions that you make in the moments where you're just kind of sitting on the couch, beating off, watching Netflix. And of course, a lot of important things in our lives are the result of marginal gains aggregating and our daily habits, tiny little, otherwise unremarkable choice points. But there are also decisive game day decisions that could decide what happens to you in your life for years down the road. These moments where you're in contact with the unforgiving, where there are selection pressures. I guess maybe I would use an evolutionary analogy to think about why the unforgiving is actually our friend. If we received nothing but applause our entire life, why would we ever need to develop ability? You know, the degree to which we can be confident that improved outcomes represent increased skill is inversely proportionate to the allowable error margin. So let's try to think about that for a minute. It's harsh on one hand to be rejected, to be defeated, to be concussed or have your arm broken. But it's also feedback. And it's a feedback that not everybody gets. Because if it's fuzzy, the feedback that you get dealing with the forgiving. The forgiving would seem to be the less cruel option. But you can't trust what the forgiving tells you. Because the forgiving might give you a positive result just because it's being forgiving, just to make you feel better. You don't actually know that an increase in your results represents an increased skill level or an improvement in your development as a man. And if you surround yourself with the forgiving all your life, if you never are exposed to harsh criticism and the harsh nature of life, then you have nothing that's going to allow you and or incentivize you to become someone or something exceptional. You know, you think about the kinds of people that you see in MMA, in engineering, studying classical music, you know, musicians, performers of all kinds, versus the kinds of people you see in gender studies or, you know, postmodern philosophy. In the former, that first set of examples, you have fields and disciplines where if you fuck it up, then people are going to let you know about it. It's going to be very public. It's going to be very embarrassing. It's going to be very unpleasant. So you goddamn better well practice. You have to go out and either, you know, compete, perform, whatever it might be, on a regular basis to maintain that skill set. Because practice and performance are, you know, maybe related but separate things. Whereas if you have a field that tells you, oh, no matter what you think, whatever you think is right, it's about how you feel. It's up to your interpretation. There's no actual standard that you must adhere to. And if you can never be wrong, well, you can never be right. And if you can never be right, you can never improve. You have no higher aim to move toward. You're never going to march toward a better version of you. Fundamentally, what this whole lying thing had me thinking about, then all this tangent that I just went down, is how much of what we perceive of as immutable reality is simply an invented set of narratives. How many of the stories that we believe to be true about ourselves are simply a set of chains and prisons separating us from the natural order of things? How in tune are we with the beast? And I've started to think recently that we kind of know what to do. We kind of know where to go. But as Nietzsche said, when the higher self speaks, it speaks demandingly. And so often we don't listen to it. Often we shut it out, deny that we ever heard it, question its calling, question its directions. Postpone, say, nah, I'll do it tomorrow. Well, that doesn't really make sense because my mom told me this. Well, my dad wants me to be a doctor, so I can't go do this other crazy thing that is really in line with what I know I'm supposed to be doing. The mind, the thinking mind, the thing that we come to identify with as ourselves, which is really, it's just a voice in our head, but we think of it as us. It's a precision instrument. It's something that's made for taking apart, solving, and putting back together complex problems. And it's for use in very specific situations. But our culture has deified it and glorified it as the solution to everything. A scalpel was not meant for chopping down trees, and the thinking mind is not the solution to every problem. Nietzsche talked about a couple of concepts that I think are pretty poignant here. One in Untimely Meditations 2, he says of man, he has lost and destroyed his instinct and can no longer trust the divine animal and let go their reins when his understanding falters and his way leads through deserts. In the genealogy of morality, he talks about ancient instincts regulating unconscious and infallible drives, archaic helpers. So let's try to tie these concepts together. One of my grappling coaches, real interesting guy. If there's anybody who is proof of the existence of these archaic helpers of such an instinct existing and being helpful, of this divine animal. That's what I mean when I say the beast. If there's anyone that's proof of concept, it's him. This is a guy, he's very intuitive. The gym that I go to switched locations recently. And while we were changing over, some of the guys would bring the mats over in their car, this piece of equipment, this set of weights, piece by piece, just moving it over to the new facility. And I saw one of my coaches working with the nail gun. And kind of stapling up the mats to the wall. And I asked him, "Hey, coach, where'd you learn how to do that?" Because he was handy with that gun, man. And he said, "Well, no one taught me. I just started doing it." Okay. I gotta, as somebody who, whenever I want to do anything, I will do extensive research first. And that can be both a boon and a benefit. No matter how small it is, if I want to go buy a new jump rope, then I'll do extensive research on jump roping, what the best jump ropes are, the anatomy of the piece of equipment. And sometimes that's good, but sometimes it's also just a form of procrastination. And so I was like, okay, what do you mean? Like, how do you know how to do it? And he paused and he kind of cocks his head to the side. He said, "Knowledge is in the air, man," in a Brazilian Portuguese accent, of course. I'm like, knowledge is in the air. What does that even mean? And he just explained to me how he sees things. And he said that he would just kind of look at the way the mats and gyms were held up, or the way this building is constructed or this house is made, and he would just say, "Oh, okay, these two joints fit together like this. These two pieces of wood lay on top of each other like that. You put a screw through this way. It makes sense." I would say that he's peeling back layers of artifice and revealing the reality beneath it. And this is an example of how I think our thinking mind, phrasing it like that is kind of ironic, of how our thinking mind can cloud, not clarify, our perception. Because where I would look at those things and think, all right, well, I need to understand the history of how these structures came to be, so I understand the logic of how, engineering developments brought this science to its modern form, and I have to understand these different techniques, and I have to practice on, smaller pieces of wood, and gradually, he just said, you know what, I can figure it out. I can look at it and shut out all that bullshit that I just spat into the mic and just say, just look at it. That's how he conducts his life. He just does. He goes based on feeling, and things have worked out for him pretty well so far. And what's interesting is he says that he used to be a big overthinker. And he used to spend all his time thinking about, well, what if this and what if that, or I'm going to plan for these 16 different contingencies. He said it never helped him. He said it only made his life miserable. It only clouded things for him and brought him away from where he felt he was supposed to be, where he felt happiest. And there's something in there, man. There's something powerful in there for all of us. What if we got back in touch with this divine animal? I'm not necessarily sure how yet. If we started trying to listen to that voice inside our head. No, maybe not the voice inside our head. The voice inside our heart. Operating on the level of instinct. Telling us what to steer away from, what to steer toward. To embrace the unforgiving. To not cloud things so much with thinking about contingencies and what ifs and more study and more preparation and more tactics. To really look beyond the set of scripts that we've been given to follow. And though all the world may be a stage, to start writing our own lines, deciding what we're going to say and why, in service of what. To not merely accept that the world we're being shown is the only one that exists, but to peel back those layers of reality with the sight of the divine animal and see things as they are. I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up. We'll see how the audio turns out on the new mic. Again, work in progress. Shout out to France. See you next episode.